Hi, everyone. So glad you could join us today. We are doing my version of a special Earth Day session. Today, we are going to talk about how to help you think through on establishing your ESG priorities. It can be very challenging to think through what types of things you need to think about. So what are those factors that are involved in the decision making? And I know many of you have kind of been reviewing what you've done for 2022, thinking through what you should do for 2023. You have some plans that you're still thinking through. What are some of the right plans to initiate? So I'm excited for us to have this program today. And we're going to talk through this in a real practical manner and talking about it through like a carbon management case study. So I am super excited to introduce you to Brian. Brian is amazing. I mentioned to all of you in my session email that he has done some amazing things that we're going to ask him later about the James Webb Telescope. But Brian is an experienced leader in corporate sustainability and an aerospace engineer with 18 years of experience in the aerospace sector. And so he launched One Small Step, and it was with a vision to guide companies in navigating all of the complexities of sustainability. And the idea is to take one small step at a time so that you can have these impactful results. So previously, we talked about Brian being in the aerospace sector. So he led the environmental sustainability and ESG programs at Northrop Grumman, and he has 12 years of experience focused on sustainability strategy, goal setting, program implementation, as well as ESG stakeholder engagement and disclosure. And so before coming into this space, he spent 7 years as a design engineer on the F-35 and James Webb Telescope, as I just mentioned. And he has done some really amazing things, and I'm really excited to introduce you to him. So before we get started in our session, I'm just going to remind everyone that we're going to keep everyone muted. We're going to run it like a traditional webinar. If you have questions, by all means, raise your hand, use the question box, and we'll just kind of answer questions as we go along. So without Brian, thank you so much for talking with us today, and I'm just going to hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join the webinar today. Hopefully you walk away with some practical perspective of how to get started in your journey, or if you're in the middle of it, some ways that you can kind of tweak your process along the way. I feel like from my more than a decade experience inside of corporate sustainability, I carry a unique lens of a really more practical and kind of grounded approach to how to think about getting started in ESG and sustainability and carbon management. I've been through the ringer, I've been through the process. I know what it takes to really get these things done and how to prioritize those resources, time, and effort. And so, I bring that very practical lens to how to get started. And again, my business name is One Small Step for that sole reason is just you have to start small. You can't do it all in this very complex space. So I want to start today just talking about the big picture of how do you get started in ESG? How do you really hone in on your priorities? And then I'm going to dig very deeply into carbon management as a goal setting exercise. What does it look like to go through that process and hone in a goal and then put the information out on the street? So to get started, before you even really move down this process, these are some things just to really think about up front. You don't necessarily have to have all of the answers, but it's helpful to have some perspective of where your organization stands on some of these things. Thinking about the current state and where are you today, where are your current strengths and weaknesses around the various ESG topics, what's driving the activity? Is it an internal leader saying we need to do this? Is a specific client asking you to disclose information that you haven't done before? Understanding who and why is really important to going into this journey. It's also really helpful to know who internally is going to champion the activity. and not just from who's going to do the work, but who's going to really, from a leadership lens, make sure that it has that full leadership support, because this is really a cross-functional business activity and business strategy activity that really needs strong leadership support and decision making. It's also really helpful to know who your key internal stakeholders are, not just who has a say in the process, but who some of your better advocates are that see the vision, see the need, and can help bring other people along in that journey. When you think about resource requirements, nothing can be done without time and money and people. So it's really helpful to understand where is your organization, what kind of resources are they willing to put behind it, because that will also help define how much you can do and how fast you can do it. You really need to understand who can lead the process. You need that one person internally that's going to just take control and make sure that it gets done, but also be mindful of, in the different buckets and categories, who's going to do that work. Do you have somebody that does your community engagement programs, that could do carbon accounting? Who is out there that can help support you and take ownership of their specific subject matter expert area? And then it's always helpful to kind of think, like, what is my end objective when I start this process? What am I trying to accomplish near term? Is there an immediate need, immediate client request, leadership expectation that I have to get done? But also, what is that longer term vision? Do you need a longer term vision? Are you looking that far out in that more so 3 to 5 year horizon? Are you really trying to integrate a new strategy for the business around sustainability and what the future looks like and where your impact can be? And it's also, again, really helpful to know who are those stakeholders that you're really trying to engage and meet expectations for. You can't meet everybody's expectations. You know who your core clients are, who your core stakeholders are, and you need to really understand what are they looking for and how's that going to drive your thinking along the way. So I want to walk now through kind of this process of, you say, I want an ESG strategy. How do we do that? And this will kind of give you those few steps along the way and what that looks like to go from having no idea what to focus on to knowing what those topics are, and then starting to set up goals, build out programs, etc. So starting back on that stakeholder front, really understanding internal stakeholders, primarily executive leadership, but some subject matter experts in the company, as well as external. What do they think about ESG and what is important to the organization? And where is the organization's real impact globally? It's helpful to look at your industry as a whole and then your specific peers. So you may have peers that are more directly in the same business lines as you are, rather than the broader legal industry. So it's really helpful to hone in and see, what are they focused on? What do you have to more or less compete with in terms of messaging and programs with the similar clients? Looking at your clients and your customers in the lens of what's important to them. What are they trying to solve? What business challenges are they communicating around ESG? What visions have they set? And how can you roll up to support them in meeting their goals? Employees are also a big part of it, and really understanding what your workforce prioritizes, how they view sustainability and their role in having a positive impact, and honing that in to know, what do your employees really want out of the company in this vision for sustainability? And then just thinking about that broader context of other stakeholders, community members, investors, which may not necessarily apply to most of you, but supply chain. There's a much broader ecosystem of stakeholders that you could be thinking about that should have some sort of involvement in this process, or not involvement, I guess, in terms of conversations, but you should be looking at some of those key groups and understanding what their priorities are. And that can just be a desktop review, doing benchmarking, looking at their sustainability reports, their websites, but seeing what those core topics are that they are prioritizing, that they're setting goals around, that they've indicated are their top 5 or 10 material topics. So the end result of that first pillar is really a list of these priority topics that your broader stakeholder base are communicating are important to them. From there, it's really the next step is to understand from that big list, how do you get down to the relevant topics for your organization? How do you get to the material topics, the ones that you really should be focusing on? And then the priority topics, those top things that you want to have robust programs around, goals, aspirations, etc. So to get there, the second step is to really evaluate your current programs relative to all of those topics that came out of the stakeholder analysis. So
Brian, let me interrupt you for a second. So
Sure.
Is this where you would suggest firms, would you expect them to do a full materiality assessment, or because that's where a lot of organizations are going. So what's your thought on that?
It's a lot of work. And if you're just starting off, I feel like it's better to do more of a desktop review of your stakeholder priorities and expectations to first shape your initial thinking of what should you be focused on and what do you have today, and do that gap analysis before you go out and start having these really detailed conversations and interviews with all of your stakeholders. If you don't have that perspective, it's hard to communicate and understand and listen to your stakeholders on these topics. So I think materiality assessments are very useful, but for me, starting off with that in-depth conversation with your stakeholders is a little bit too much for most smaller organizations to get started. And there's no right or wrong way to go through this process. You can start with the materiality assessment and do it all right away if that's how you want to do it and put those resources behind it. But you can really get a solid understanding of where you should be placed and where you should be focusing just by doing more of a desktop style review of your various stakeholders' expectations and what they're focused on. I think it's helpful to layer in that materiality assessment after you have time to go through a process like this, and then fine tune it. Move some things around a little bit once you hear a little bit more from the various stakeholders.
So it sounds like it shouldn't stop you from making progress.
No.
Not, we need to do this before we actually try to make some effort into an initiative.
I don't think so. And there's so many ways to start and finish, and at this point, there's really not one right answer. It's really comes down to the capacity of your organization and how fast you can or want to move, and how robust you want to be, full spectrum versus deep in specific areas. And every organization has to kind of go through that journey to figure that out.
Okay, great, thanks.
So the current state analysis in terms of your current ESG programs, understanding what you're doing well, where you have gaps. Maybe it's a gap, but it's not a topic that's distinctly relevant for you, and that's okay. But going through that assessment and really understanding where you are today is important to then refining these topics and saying, okay, we're ready to set an aspiration, hone in what our material topics are and what we want to really prioritize. So this becomes some really deep thinking inside the organization about aspiration. And where do you want to take this? Do you want to be a leader? You just want to be in the mix and meeting your stakeholders' expectations? Do you want to have specific areas where you can demonstrate clear leadership? There's a whole spectrum there. And again, it's really just comes down to the organization and where you are in your journey and what you're looking to accomplish. So typically you'll define kind of an ESG mission statement. What do you want to focus on? What's the impact you want to have? How are you going to integrate ESG and sustainability into your company? And then hone that down into the material topics and priority topics that you want to focus on. This is going to be the core part of your sustainability program. And this is where you're going to build out all of your activities and messaging. So once you can define that state, then you move into building out your ESG programs. So where you have gaps, understanding where those are, developing a roadmap for how you can close those gaps. Sometimes you can do it in a few months. Sometimes it's going to take a year or two to really go through the full process. And then also deciding where do you want to set goals? Do you want a goal? What's the value of a goal, internal or external? And again, this is a full spectrum of, sometimes it's helpful to have a goal to show externally that you're committed to a certain aspiration or ambition. You don't always have to have the answer for how you're going to get there. A lot of organizations like to have a very clear, distinct roadmap before they can communicate that externally. But thinking through that and understanding what are the resources, time, effort, commitment that I'm going to have to put into this over the next few years to meet that goal. Another really important part is defining your management structure. So who is going to lead this and champion bringing it all together, engaging with leadership where there's pain points, telling the message externally. Who is that one person who's going to have that responsibility? And then in each of your material and priority topics, who's going to do that work? Who's going to own that subject matter, content, program development, execution, funding, etc. Really thinking through that whole spectrum of how does this actually move forward effectively in the organization. A lot of times when these programs get started, it's added onto somebody's plate part-time on top of their full-time job. And so thinking through how do we get this done in a sustainable way by resources going forward is really important. So from here, I want to kind of deep dive into the greenhouse gas emissions and give kind of a more practical example of how you really think about this program build out, the steps I would take, and really any specific area. This happens to be a more numerical subject, so there's more measurement to it, but walking through how to measure, how to set the goal, what to think about in that process. So I broke it up into really 3 different approaches or steps along the way. First is around how do you get the measurement, understand what your emissions even are today, that baseline of information that you need to really inform the strategy. And then what does it take to set goals and actually reduce those emissions? What things should you be thinking about in that process? And then what does it take to disclose? And how do you think about that, not just from a carbon perspective, but then bring this back to ESG more holistically? How do you do it? What should you be thinking about? Should you develop a report? Should you disclose to certain structured disclosures? But what are some of the steps of thinking and logic there before putting all the information out? So again, thinking up front, and I'm a little bit more of a reserved personality and leader. I like to think more diligently about how I'm going to manage a topic, not necessarily have it all figured out, but think about some of the pain points and challenges along the way and have a little bit more of a plan before I just jump in. And so I like to think hard about this first step of how are we going to do this? Who is going to lead this effort? Do they have the subject matter expertise to do some of the detailed work? It's not always the case that you're going to have an expert in greenhouse gas emissions or an environmental compliance expert from a more environmental engineering lens. So who can help spearhead this effort? Who's a good process leader that understands it enough to engage either an internal person that can do the work or an external party that can help really bring that subject matter expertise to the process. And that's an important thing, especially with carbon, because it is really a expertise that not a lot of companies have in-house out of the gate, is to think about who is a good partner that you can bring in to project manage, do the data collection, do all of the calculations for you. You can do that in-house, but it's significant time and effort and something that's easily outsourced to a good partner. From a data gathering perspective, and kind of getting technical here, so scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are emissions resulting from your business operations. So scope 1 is primarily natural gas for office buildings, maybe some fleet fuel. Scope 2 is all of your electricity. So if you think of that, that's a lot of utility data. So most of the effort in this measurement process is engaging each of your buildings and whoever that building manager is for you, and getting the utility data from them, which means they may need to go to a landlord to get that utility data. They may need to log into the utility account if they have access to that to pull all 12 months bills out of the system. That is a pretty involved process. It's probably 70–80% of the work is getting the information. Doing the calculations, from my perspective, is a little bit easier. Once you get the information off the bills and into an Excel file, that's pretty quick. But reading 12 months utility bills for electricity and natural gas for 10, 20, 30 buildings takes time. A key part of that is engaging with landlords, which is never easy. And depending on the size of your organization, if you have the utility account under your name in the building, if you're a small tenant, sometimes the landlords won't give you the data or question why you need the data. So you have to estimate. That process can be a little tedious sometimes. Scope 3 emissions is everything else in your value chain. So it's employee commuting, it's your business travel, emissions from the purchased goods and services. So it's a much broader data set and requires a lot of different stakeholders to engage with and to pull that information. And sometimes you have the systems in place where you can easily get that. You may have a central management system for business travel, and a lot of times now those vendors will have a greenhouse gas report that they can send you, or at least are tracking your mileage on a detailed basis. If you don't have that, then it's a lot of estimation based on spend data. So this also gets a little tedious. It's a lot of different people to talk to pull that data together.
So we had a conversation about this, Brian, but like now remote work is something that's very prevalent now amongst law firms. Many of them have remote positions. A lot of folks are doing hybrid. What's your thought about collecting remote work data?
Yeah, it's a really interesting shift, and there isn't a lot of really clear or consistent guidance on this right now because it is such a change in how we work the last couple of years. And so companies are starting to think about this and figure it out. At the end of the day, if employees are shifting to virtual work, you should be seeing a reduction in scope 1 and scope 2 because you should be getting out of leases and out of buildings. And so if that is a key business strategy for you, is going virtual, closing office buildings to help reduce your greenhouse gas emissions ultimately, then you should be thinking about how to calculate this in your scope 3, because all you're doing is shifting that laptop emissions from in a building you own to your employee's house, and that needs to go into the scope 3. Technically, it goes into employee commuting category, but estimating that can be challenging. And so getting numbers on how many people are virtual, how many days a week they're virtual, that can be a little bit more detailed. And so with scope 3, there's so many categories, and you really have to understand which ones are material to your company, which ones are really big numerically. Purchased goods and services from procurement spend is usually one of the larger categories. So it may be more valuable for you initially to spend more time on the procurement data part of it than trying to hone in on your employee emissions at home. And you can add that in a second iteration or do a very high level estimate at first and then hone that in later on. But it really comes down to where do you spend your time and effort and how material is that category. So another example would be diesel in backup generators in buildings. Every building has to test the generators for compliance rules. So there's a little bit of diesel that's burned every year, but it's not material to your emissions. So chasing that data isn't really valuable. Similarly, on the employee virtual work front, may or may not be material. Doing some assessment there is helpful, deciding if you want to spend the time and effort to really calculate that. If it's a core part of your strategy, you should probably be doing it. Otherwise, you may be able to kick it down the road a year or two till you really understand the rest of your scope 3 and where you want to put your effort.
Now, would you suggest that in terms of, when you're considering, okay, you might have the reduced employee commuting, which might be somewhat offset by the changes to remote work emissions?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's a shift there, and employee commuting calculations are also very high level estimates. And so honing that in, knowing how much difference it is, you have to kind of dig into it to really understand the impact. But you're right in that there's some offset there initially to where it may not matter that much to your total inventory. And
You know, go ahead. Go ahead.
part of this too is, especially with scope 3, is it's a journey, and nobody is doing it perfect or totally right today. Not even the Googles and the Microsofts. They don't have all of their primary raw data they need to really do this precisely. So everybody's in this constant evolution of, let's calculate it once. Okay, now I understand it. Now I can refine it the next year, keep refining it. So it is more of a journey in these categories to getting them right in the end.
So how should I consider, because I think this goes through a lot of law firms' minds, is how do you consider if something really is worth the time and effort? So you just mentioned the piece about the diesel. Now, when you and I were talking, I was talking about refrigerants.
Mm-hmm.
What's like a good guide to tell folks of like whether something's going to be worth the time and effort for collecting it?
From a greenhouse gas perspective, it's very focused on how material is it to your total inventory. And so there is kind of a de minimis lens of 5% or so that you can exclude because it's not material to your inventory. And there's varying kind of ways to implement that. You know, good outside expertise can really help you just jump to the chase or jump to the answer before you have to do a lot of analysis on some of those, just based on other clients and best practices. But it really is helpful to look at it from a numeric lens to say, well, my procurement spend emissions are 50,000 metric tons and refrigerants could be 100. So is it worth spending time on 100 to calculate that? Can I just do a quick calculation and get it close? Or is it even valuable to spend effort there? So you really look at it from that materiality lens of how much impact does it have to your total number? And then two ways to look at it. If you want to just do it to have completeness, then there's ways to do very high level estimates on it. Then it's at least there. It may have some variability in terms of precision, but it's at least on the line item rather than omitted. And you can just leave it at that. You spend very little effort, put the number in there and leave it there for a few years until you have time to dig into that more if there's value to doing that.
Right. Okay, very good. Thank you.
And I think with scope 3, you know, one of my recommendations is to really start with a high level screening on emissions. Get the data that you can get, go through all the categories and see what you can calculate from kind of a 50,000 foot level of assessment. So maybe it's total procurement dollars times a standard emission factor for spend to get an emissions number. Sure, that may vary by 20, 30%, but out of the gate, that's probably enough to see what categories are really impactful for you. And then where do you want to spend more effort to break your spend data down to get more precise emission factors and map it at a much more detailed level. That's an exercise to go through, and I think doing a high level screening first saves you some time and money to get the first estimate, understand where to put your focus, and then you can kind of go to that next level of detail.
Yeah.
So when it comes to calculating the greenhouse gas footprint, this for me is really the easier part. There's pretty standard methodologies and emission factors for converting kilowatt hours and therms of natural gas or to greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, when it comes to that, again, it depends on how you engage external parties. A lot of outside experts will have an Excel tool that they can use to calculate emissions. This is pretty manageable for smaller organizations that are primarily office-based. If you think about it, it's a line for natural gas, it's a line for electricity, times an emission factor. So whether that's 50 buildings, 50 rows of data, or 100 rows of data, it's fairly easy to manage in Excel and do those calculations for the near term. If you're a larger organization, if you really want to think long-term, have extra resources to put into a software system, there is value to that, but it's not necessary. Again, for office-based organizations, you don't have complex operations where you have a lot of different emission sources at one facility. You don't have a lot of scope 1 emission sources and various gases that have a lot of different calculations to them. So the value of a greenhouse gas emission software is really to help you do trending and reporting maybe a little bit easy. The hook here is though that you need to have someone inside the company that can spend enough time in the system to be an expert on how to put data in the system and how to get data out of the system. I've had this experience a lot in the past is at our business unit and site level, we do data collection once a year. They're in the system once a year. They're always calling my team for support to how to log in, how to get to some place in the system, how to run a report. If you're not in there continuously throughout the year, you got to ask someone else for help to how to use the system. A lot of the systems are a little bit easier now. There's a lot on the market. But again, it's the value of having a software there that you jump into once or twice a year, or just a good Excel file that you can run some pivot tables, and pretty much everybody knows how to use Excel. So that's an easier system for pulling data out and doing analysis and trending. It's really up to you though, and where you want to spend mostly your time on this one, or money on this one, and when that is valuable for you going forward. Maybe once you set a goal and you get a couple of years of data, then it makes sense to transition to a simple software system so that you can see a little bit more trending and at the building level and some of those details. Another big part of this process is the third-party assurance or verification. And this again is one of those things that it's kind of a leadership criteria, but it's a point for you to think, when are we ready for this and when do we find value in it? If your stakeholders aren't asking for it, if you're not quite ready to set a goal, or if you have a goal but it's not a super ambitious goal, the verification may not be the right thing to do right away. It adds time to your process because someone has to audit your data before you can disclose it. It adds money because you have to pay the auditor to do that. So when does it make sense for you to go through that process? There is value. A lot of times you'll get some good findings from that to help you hone your process and how you're getting to the data, and finding some areas along the way. So it helps you get better, but having that stamp of approval, it really depends on who's asking for it. And the CDP climate disclosure, you'll get an extra point. It may not matter if you're in the middle of the scoring bracket, you may not need that extra point. So it is, again, leadership. It shows that you have a good understanding of your greenhouse gas footprint. But at this point, it's not totally required to have that. Maybe future rules from EU or the US SEC may require verification on certain data sets, but right now it's not a requirement. So I think you have the flexibility to be thoughtful when it makes sense for you to start that journey.
So I'm going to interrupt you again. So it's like when you're thinking about assurance or the verification, that is a pretty big spend number. And it's really kind of considering, do you want to go through the time and is it worth that spend to get that extra CDP point, or what if it's required, say, for working for a particular client, right? Like, does that make sense? Or is it something that maybe you wait for a few years to kind of see how things are trending sort of in the marketplace of what's necessary? Is that kind of the sort of like the thought process?
Yeah, that is how I would approach it. And, again, it's different when you're in a Fortune 100 company. There's different pressures and expectations, especially in climate right now, for what that looks like. But as the expectations are kind of rolling down into that supply chain, into the smaller organizations, or smaller organizations just want to get this under control, it's different. If you're a small company, you have very limited time, resources, and people to put behind this stuff. So you really have to hone in, where do you put your effort? Where do you derive value? How do you create value for your customer also, or client? Spending money on this, really providing any additional value at this point in time. All right, so moving on to goal setting and thinking about how you would reduce emissions. And kind of put some things on the right here around more of a lens for office-based organizations like law firms, because I think it is a unique thing to think ahead of, okay, I have a goal, now how do I accomplish that goal? And think about what your levers are, because that may influence how you would have set that goal in the first place. So again, starting with really understanding the context. What are your drivers for setting a goal? Is a specific client asking, do you have an ambition within the law firm? Do you have a big environmental practice and you just feel like it's time for you to also have a climate goal? Where are you in the process? Have you done greenhouse gas reporting for a couple years? Or is this your first year? And what level of ambition? Do you want to be a net zero company by the 2050 horizon? Or do you want to be a net zero company next year? And these are levers that you really have to think about, what it's going to take to get there, and then what kind of leadership support do you have for that. When you think about the goal structure, again, there's a lot of ways to do this. No company is very consistent on what's included or what the time horizon is. I think what's nice today from where goal setting was when I got into the sustainability space 12, 13, 14 years ago, is at that point in time, companies were picking random numbers for reductions, 50%, 30%, 20%, different base years, different end years. It was really hard to tell if any company was making any measurable progress against another. At least today, we all have a similar trajectory around net zero everything by 2050 to meet the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree climate warming scenario. So at least that's kind of the tone of the ambition for everybody. And to get there, they're looking at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That requires roughly 4% a year reduction in emissions to get there. So the end state's the same. Now the only variability is just how inclusive is the goal for organizations, and then at what time horizon are they meeting that big objective. Scope 1 and scope 2, this is really all about your buildings. This is where you're going to have the most control. You can really see measurable reductions through renewable energy procurement and carbon offsetting and energy efficiency measures. Scope 3, much more complex. You have less control. The calculations are higher level estimates and more general data sets. So you have to think about your level of ability to influence your scope 3 emissions and what it's going to take to actually reduce those. That's a long game. If you want to reduce those fast, the only way to do that is really buying carbon credits. Again, pure expense for the company. There's not a lot of direct value for that, rather other than the messaging lens and having, for the environmental benefit, a net zero organization. Time horizon, most companies are kind of locking in on 2030, 2035, 2040, or 2050. And that varies depending, again, on the scopes that they include in their goal. So larger, more complex organizations from an operations lens are doing scope 1 and scope 2 net zero operations in that 2030, 2040 timeframe. And then they're adding the scope 3 aspiration for 2050. Kind of pushing that out there, saying that's a long play. There's a lot to build up to reducing scope 3, and we have a lot of processes we want to put in place first before we try to zero it out. And that zeroing out the residual emissions piece, again, that's carbon offsetting. Technologies don't exist today to totally transition to a clean power economy. So if you want to do it faster than the technology can get you there, renewable energy procurement and carbon offsets. A key thing to think about also is the Science-Based Target Initiative and getting a verified goal. So this is the gold standard in goals now. A lot of the larger corporations are setting science-based targets, especially professional services firms, because they don't have the complex operations in the very large scope 3 footprint from products that to offset. So they can hone that in and set these goals and have a little nearer time horizon on those. It's not a requirement yet. Some customers, clients may want you to have a science-based target. That is one of the trends of kind of meeting the 2050 net zero ambitions, is to engage your supply chain and get them to set greenhouse gas goals and science-based targets. So you really have to think about what are your customers' expectations here, and how soon do you need to be on that pathway? The key thing is that a verified SBTI requires scope 3 if it's bigger than 40% of your total, which it is most of the time for professional services, between procurement spend, emissions, and business travel, usually two of the bigger categories. So it's really important to go back to the top here and really understand the context and what's your ambition, and do you need that stamp of approval on that goal right now? It's not required. You can technically have a science-aligned goal that follows the principles of science-based targets without going through a very exhaustive review process for that goal. You can't say it's science-based. You have to be very delicate on the wording, kind of like a greenwashing marketing perspective. But there are ways to say that you're following the 1.5 degree scenarios, you're aligned with the science kind of softly without being a SBTI verified. So kind of thinking about these levers for reduction, I mentioned renewable energy and carbon offsets a few times, but I think a really important thing to think about for professional services companies when you want to set a goal and think about how you're going to actually reduce emissions, it comes down to your office buildings for scope 1 and scope 2, and what level of control do you have? Do you own them or lease them? Are you a large or small tenant? If you're 1,000 square feet in a 100,000 square foot building, how much influence are you going to have on the landlord to say your cooling tower is not efficient, I want you to upgrade it so that I can reduce my emissions or water consumption or whatever it might be? So that's something to really think about. Owning the utility account is also very important. If you own it, then you can get the data, but you're also paying for the electricity directly. So any process improvement, energy efficiency activities that you may put in place, you will get that direct benefit back to your account through reduced energy consumption. If you're just paying the landlord a flat fee, triple net lease, then that's a little different conversation, and that incentive isn't in there for you to make investments or to reduce energy and get the direct result in that. You have to really work with the landlord to figure out what can we do for the betterment of the building, and if the landlord will give you the data. Again, if you have to estimate for the building, the estimate's probably going to be higher than what the actual building uses. So how do you influence an estimate going forward? You can only get the data and then make improvements to the building. Looking at scope 3, again, I mentioned this is really a long-term play. It's something to really think hard about, because the precision of the data, the complexity of some of the emission factors and the processes to do those calculations, this can take some time to really refine it to a point to where you feel like you have a well-refined scope 3 number that really represents how you operate. So maybe you went out and surveyed all of your employees about their commuting habits, and got it down to really a local level and almost an employee level for how much they're commuting. But it can take time to get better data, refine the calculation, engage all those different stakeholders to really refine those numbers. And so you should really give yourself some time to do that before just going out and saying, we're gonna purchase carbon credits to offset all of our scope 3 at a significant cost to the business. At least maybe take a year or two to refine the data down a little before making that decision. You can still set the aspiration, but no, at the end of the day, it's carbon credits that are going to get you there in the near term.
So, you mentioned, we kind of talked a bit about this a little bit before, but just how setting many of these goals will require financial commitment. Can you just kind of give a little bit more guidance on what you would advise in terms of setting goals and how to think through those financial commitments? When we talked about SBTI, we talked about, if people want to actually get verified, like what's purchasing carbon credits? If you can just maybe expand on that a little.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at your buildings and efficiency upgrades, most of the time it's going to be your landlord that's probably going to make the investment in the building. You may be able to make some small investments that have 3, 4, 5 year paybacks, mostly on lighting, because those are things maybe you can control in the confines of your office space. But when it comes to the building HVAC, that's a landlord investment. So being willing to talk to your landlord and understand that if he makes that decision, that's going to come at a cost to you, and being willing to absorb that cost is part of that dialogue, and that becomes operational expense at your individual site level, depending on how you manage your budgets. From a renewable electricity perspective, you can, and carbon credits, you can go to a good broker and get some rough estimates of what those cost today on the marketplace and run that against your total need and kind of get a good range for what that cost would be if you went out and just bought all of that today to be net zero. The renewable electricity and carbon credit pricing can change quarterly, monthly. So it's really hard to be a predictor, especially now with so many companies setting big targets. They need the carbon credit, so it's putting pressure on the carbon credit market. The renewable electricity, if you can work with your landlord to get them to make the decision at the building level and buy it directly from the utility where that's feasible, then at least it's coming through your utility bill as an operational expense. And it's a little bit more directly tied to each of the entities or locations, rather than buying a bunch of renewable energy certificates at the corporate level and then having that corporate cost. Maybe that's how you want to manage it. Maybe that's more effective, but there's different ways to kind of have that cost impact the organization.
So I have a fun question for you. So say a firm is considering whether they should invest in, they have a budget and they can either use that pocket of money to change some procedure, purchase some kind of equipment, whatever it might be, to reduce impact within their operations, or they can purchase potentially some kind of credits to, for their scope 1 or scope 2. What would you advise for a firm who has a budget and they're looking at, okay, well, I know I want to do CDP, I want to do SBTI, I have this pocket of money. Do I just buy credits, or do I spend this money doing the work internally so that we reduce our impacts with emissions?
The challenge with buying carbon credits or renewable energy certificates is that's an annual cost. So you may have budget this year, but if you buy them once, you have to buy them in perpetuity. Buying them for a year and then not buying them for a couple of years, that just doesn't really work with the intent of reducing your carbon emissions long term. So these are long-term commitments. You need to be willing to pay that price and the fluctuations of those prices year over year. I think, especially if you're just getting started, it's always better to show that you're taking action to try and improve and reduce emissions first before going out to these market-based mechanisms to reduce emissions. Now, climate purists will tell you we need zero emissions today, and that's the only way we're going to meet these net zero goals. So go buy the credits and offsets now so that we're not emitting stuff today. Again, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of what it's like to be in an organization to make these decisions. And I think it's more impactful, at least early in your journey, to spend the time and effort on actually process improvements and trying to reduce your emissions, honing in your data, understanding things better, then go out and make these really decisions to essentially offset the emissions that you can't reduce directly.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
So we're coming up on time, so I'll touch on this briefly and then make sure we have time for any additional questions from the audience. But disclosure is a really important piece, and this is probably where most of the reasons that you even want to think about ESG strategy or carbon goal setting is because someone's asking you to disclose information. So it's really important, again, to think of context. Why are you doing it? Who's your stakeholder? What's your objective? And thinking about then how do you do it? There's the GRI standard is really the best in terms of thinking through how to structure your information and hit on your material topics. And SASB is a little bit more industry specific. That's a much smaller set. It'll describe maybe 10 impact topics to focus on. But GRI is really that most comprehensive, cuts across every industry, this is how you should think about disclosure. At the end of the day, though, it really comes down to how do you want to disclose and what's the reasoning. So could you just improve your website, put more information up there, have a central ESG page that links out to your philanthropy, to your environmental goals, et cetera? Do you want to have a ESG sustainability report that tells your story? Maybe it's only 10 pages, but it has that information all in one place that you can hand a customer, hand an employee, to show what your vision for sustainability is and all the great work that your company's doing. CDP, EcoVadis are two that I've heard of, especially within legal industry. CDP is very climate specific. EcoVadis is ESG broad and is actually a lot more exhaustive process in terms of what you have, the questions you answer and the information you upload to essentially be verified that you have robust ESG programs in these topic areas. That's a major platform for a lot of companies to roll out for their supply chain and getting some level of assurance that their suppliers have a base program around all of these ESG topics. What I'll say to CDP briefly is it isn't just about goals and data. Probably only half of the questionnaire is really about your emissions and what goal you have set. The other half is really focused around climate governance and climate related risk and opportunity management. So this is how things roll up through the leadership of your organization up to the board level. How do you look at climate risk? Have you done a scenario analysis for 20 years out to how climate could impact your business? Have you looked at the opportunities that could create for your business? How is that risk management process being implemented into business strategy? If you have not thought through that, doing CDP climate is going to be very difficult your first time through. So being thoughtful about, well, maybe we need to do an internal exercise around CDP climate, work with a third party to help us develop these questions. Maybe you have that expertise internally to do that, and then do an actual disclosure a year or two later.
So I'm going to ask one question before we kind of see if there's any questions from the group. And anyone, if you have any questions, please do put them in the question box and I'll pose them. Now we talked about, when is the time to, really kind of go all out. Some of these programs are very intense. And, you and I talked about that some of these programs are meant to push some of these companies who have the resources to really be leaders. What would you advise? Because, the folks on our call, they're going to be, in very different stages with their programs.
Aside from compliance requirements, so if the SEC comes out with their, expectations for disclosure, the CSRD, once, that comes into play. But aside from that, I think it's really important to just think about where you are. And things like SASB and SBTI, they're out there to set the bar and set the expectation for where companies should be going. But this is very much a journey and nobody really has it totally figured out. And so these smaller and medium companies that are having to address this now, you really have to think about impact, not just where do you have the most impact with your stakeholders, where can you have the most influence, but what can you do strategically? Like how can you tie your business model to sustainability and really drive impact for society and the environment? And so is getting third-party verified for your data the answer, or is spending that money on buying renewable energy the answer, or putting in a lighting project? And you have to look at each of those in terms of kind of what are the options that I have, where should I focus my effort to improve my programs, refine them, get better, or ultimately reduce in the scenario of carbon at the end of the day.
So we do have one question. Where do you recommend getting emission factors for like supply chain information?
I'm blanking on the reference. So there is a tool for this high-level screening sponsored by WRI, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's a Qantas-based tool that has some base level emission factors in there. It's maybe 20 or 30 categories, so it's not super granular. So that's a good place to start. There are other kind of input output models that go into much more detail and hundreds of categories for spend that will give you more of that granular emissions factor for that. And I can follow up with that resource, blanking on the name of it at this point.
Have you ever seen instances for office-based companies where they might be able to go to the provider to to get some of that information in terms of, say, like supply chain? So whether it's, well, any kind of supplier, do you see that happening?
To work with the landlord on it?
Whether to work with a landlord, but sometimes those emission factors, like that emission count, you can get straight from like the supplier, that they might have that.
Yeah, some suppliers will have their direct emissions, but that purchase goods and services number is really the life cycle emissions. So it's from extraction of the materials that go into the product to the manufacture of the product and shipping of the product to you. So you can get the company specific and refine that part of it, but you still have to think about the rest of the life cycle. So again, this is where is it worth the effort to go into that level of detail with your suppliers directly or not?
Right. And then I think the IPCC, don't they have like an emissions factors database too?
They do. EPA has a really good emission factor hub for, mostly US. There's a few IPCC. UK has some good factors also if you need some international factors. They have an easy to use data set for that. Also, the climate registry has a good protocol that has international emission factors as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I know we're kind of getting to our time. If anyone has any other questions, please do enter them now and I'll pose them. So, Brian, what are some last, thoughts that you would give to our folks just about, this process and just making decisions, just the overall sort of thought process?
I think it's just being very mindful of where you want to go and what you can really accomplish. There's a lot of pressures. This space is evolving every day. New expectations are coming. Large companies are setting directives and asking for information that they may or may not know what they're doing with yet. So I would make sure you really ask the question of why. And that might be to your leader. It may be to a client if they're asking you to do something. Just say why. What are you using the information for? Is it really critical that I do this today? Are you going to kick me as a supplier if I don't have this answer in 6 months? But being willing to engage and understand that, so then you can really make a good decision for how best to move forward and implement an effective and impactful program.
You know what? Since you just said that, I would love for you to answer this for everyone. So when in your previous role, when you were collecting this kind of data, how did your folks use this data when they were looking at their supply chain? I think this would really be a great understanding for folks. Very insightful.
Yeah, so at a very high level, the big trend in climate is the need to really engage the supply chain in order to really drive to net zero emissions and having corporations own that scope 3 emissions profile where they have the ability to influence emissions. And so you're seeing that roll out into these supplier questionnaires, expectations for suppliers to respond to CDP and give information. Some companies are taking active steps on the information they're receiving through those engagements. Other companies are jumping the gun and engaging before they know how they're going to interact with the data and make decisions on that, or how that's going to influence their programs going forward. And so, I think this is where I recommend really being willing to engage and ask some more questions of, well, what do you need? When do you need it? Why do you really need it? Because not every company really has that answer today. So they may be asking for it, but they may be 5 years out before they really make a decision on who they contract with based on some ESG data point or a carbon goal. Right now, it's mostly about, do you have it? Do you disclose it? Less about the ambition in all these areas. So I would be just very mindful of that. And as I described with scope 3 emissions, it's a very high level calculation. So really trying to understand how do you use this information to make different purchasing decisions, or work with your suppliers to reduce an impact where you have kind of joint interest in doing so, or using that data to refine it. But every company is very different in where they are in that journey right now. So I encourage you to just engage and understand what that expectation is very clearly before you make a big commitment to a target or a disclosure, which is really a long-lasting decision for you.
Yeah. You may or may not have this, but just curious, a couple folks were interested. Do you have any examples of supplier questionnaires?
Ooh,
That may
not
not be in your purview. It's
yeah.
fine.
I did save one recently. It's an Excel-based tool. I think it was maybe from the EPA. I can dig that up and send it to you if you want to share that link, if it is what I'm thinking. But
Yeah, it's definitely a hard thing. I mean, it's something that we're actually talking about internally, is having different kinds of questionnaires and sort of policies. So it's again, it's very top of mind, right? So how you can influence from that perspective. You know, I think that one of the things that, just from that supplier point of view, that you're being asked from like your client, like as a law firm, which is going to apply to your supplier. I think there's a few main things that you just have to think about, right? So you might want to ask about, is your supplier, are they also tracking emissions? You want to think about, like, are they tracking like continual improvements? Do they have policies? Do they have goals? Are there any certifications in the space? Those might be like some of those bigger level kinds of questions you might want to ask. And do they have like any like potentially certified materials or services? Like, for some of your suppliers and vendors, you're going to want to ask higher level questions, because sometimes if you're getting down into the weeds, which can be helpful, you have to decide, what are you going to do with that information, right? Just like your clients trying to figure out what are they going to do with the information, you have to decide if you're going to ask your supplier to supply that much information, what are you going to do with it, and which items, which things are going to potentially make you decide to do something differently. But then, we're talking about emissions. So those, just what your clients are asking you are just going to be kind of very similar things you're going to want to ask. Anyway, but we're talking about these in some of our policy group sessions when we get that started kind of at the end of the month.
Maybe hone in on, one set of suppliers. Maybe it's those that you buy laptops from, right? Or paper, or travel, right? Really, again, what can you make decisions on once you get the information?
Yeah. Brian, this was incredibly helpful. I have gotten so many questions of whether we are going to share the slides in the recording, which we absolutely will. But thank you so much for this. I think it just kind of gives everyone a good view of just, it's okay to take things one step at a time. And there's something to be said about knowing where you want to go and breaking things up into small chunks, like, do you want to be a leader? What kind of investment do you want to make, and what resources do you have to make those, improvements at this point? And, whether it's now or, in the midterm or the long term. So, everyone, thank you so much for attending. We will make the slides and the recording available. I'll send this out to everyone. And, if any of you have any questions and you want to follow up with Brian, by all means, I'll make sure that you're on the email and Brian's info is attached. Brian, thanks again so much. This was such a really great presentation, and just helping people to think, how to think through things. It's, one of the best learnings that someone can have. So.
No, happy to do so, and hopefully it was helpful, and I appreciate everybody joining today.
All right, take care, everyone.